So if substantively the unsealing was a bit of a nothing burger, what I really mean by that is that there's very little meat in what we obtained. Very little new facts. By and large, what we got was garnish. A little view into the process, the gamesmanship, the litigation strategies, and things like that. But in terms of information that actually had the potential to have some type of impact on the outcome, it was quite a thin meal indeed. So let's take a look at what some of those new facts that we learned from the unsealed documents were. So an important distinction that we need to make here that has not been so well observed in some of the commentary on these documents is the distinction between new facts, by which I mean, by and large, new evidence, and new assertions, new arguments. We've seen a lot of takes that have this perhaps deliberate, but perhaps just misinformed tendency to pick out arguments made by the attorneys and present those as if they are fact. And so one of the examples of that really stood out to me was an argument that somehow we learned that Johnny Depp had modified his photographic evidence, his evidence of his injuries. And so this is an argument that, first off, clearly was not bought by Judge Azcarate because, of course, we did get to see those photographs in evidence, just as we got to see Amber Heard's photographs in evidence. But where this came from was essentially cherry-picking a motion in limine, an argument made by Elaine that suggested that basically they were going to be able to prove that because of metadata discrepancies, Johnny was not presenting original photographs. But we also saw that there was an explanation for that because many of these photographs, Johnny didn't take them. They weren't originals on his devices. He had gotten them from Sean Bett, from other sources who were the people that took them. So that's what we're going to avoid here is we're going to carefully distinguish between what are things that attorneys presented as arguments but are not in fact facts. And we're going to instead look at what are pieces of information, evidence, documents, witness testimony, things like that we learned from this process that could have, had they been presented to the jury, factored into the decision-making process. So some of these new facts unquestionably did favor Amber Heard. We have to acknowledge that. Probably most significantly in that respect, we did see some new information revolving around the text messages of Stephen Deuters. So you'll recall that Stephen Deuters was on Johnny's witness list. He is his personal assistant, has been for quite a number of years, but he didn't actually get called to testify at trial. And it's very likely, frankly, that these text messages are part of the reason why that didn't happen. So these text messages essentially involve a conversation between Stephen and Amber Heard about the quote-unquote Boston plane incident. And you'll remember this incident as the one where Amber testified that Johnny has kicked her on this plane. We heard a very different account of this Boston plane incident from Keenan Wyatt. But to the extent that Stephen Deuters' text messages appear to support Amber Heard's version of events because they do say things like, when he kicked you, when I told him he kicked you, he cried. This does appear to be, in some respect, an admission of Amber Heard's version of events. So part of what we saw unfold in the litigation over these text messages were concerns about their authenticity. Johnny Depp had attempted to do a forensic extraction from Stephen Deuters' phone in order to obtain these messages and then be able to verify them or not. There was question on their part about whether these texts were authentic or whether they had been modified. So we saw that during this early litigation, Johnny had argued they weren't able to recover these texts from Stephen's phone. These texts were also in a different format than any other text messages that Amber had proffered as evidence. They essentially showed a video scroll through a phone rather than a screenshot or a report like the Celebrite reports that we saw for other text messages. So that tended to support their version of events that perhaps there were some questions about the authenticity of these text messages. But we did also see from the unsealed files that during the forensic examination of Amber Heard's devices, they were able to retrieve these text messages. And so that does appear to confirm their authenticity, that they were able to retrieve them in the form that she had presented them from her iCloud devices. So this is a new fact that bears on the issues in dispute in the trial and does appear to favor Amber Heard's position. The problem, though, is that we also got some new facts that undermine it. We already know from the UK where these texts were presented into evidence and where they were discussed in the testimony that Johnny, his explanation is quite simply that with Amber Heard, you had to kind of placate her. We've listened to a lot of these audio recordings now. We've seen kind of what it's like to be in an argument with Amber where things go around and around in a circle and nothing is really ever established. And so he has explained that basically the only way to get out of that process is to just kind of tell her what she wanted to hear in the hopes that you would calm her down and that she would, I think, go back to normal or whatever. So a piece of new information that we got in the unsealing is a transcript of one of these audio recordings in which the Boston Plane incident is discussed. So during this conversation, which took place in September of 2015, we see Amber Heard making a comment about Johnny, kicking her on the plane, and Johnny Depp challenging that assertion and pointing out that I did not kick you on the plane. And Amber's response to that is, I know. So while on the one hand, we have new information about the text messages from Stephen that tend to suggest favorable new information for Amber Heard that corroborates her version of the Boston Plane. On the other hand, we also have new information that corroborates Johnny Depp's version of events, that in fact there was not a kick on the plane, that Amber Heard knows this perfectly well, and instead this just became one of these issues that they talked about in terms of differences of recollection, which of course we see Johnny Depp characterizing as dishonesty and Amber Heard characterizing as simply different recollections. Another new piece of information that's potentially favorable to Amber Heard is new information that we learned from Jennifer Howell about her personal background with abuse. We see in Jennifer Howell's deposition excerpts that According to the account that Whitney gave to Jennifer, Whitney and Amber were fairly severely abused in their childhood. And it was the pattern, essentially, that Amber would take the abuse for Whitney. And so this created sort of this distorted bond where, on the one hand, Whitney is grateful to Amber for taking the abuse that she didn't have to, but that Amber would then turn and use Whitney as her whipping girl, her whipping post when she needed to let out her own rage and anger, that Whitney would be the target for that. Now, this doesn't necessarily give us any new information about Amber's allegations against Johnny, Johnny's allegations against Amber, but I mention this as something that is potentially helpful to Amber because it does shed some sympathetic light on perhaps why she is the way she is, at least if we credit this story that Whitney reported to Jennifer Howell. It shows how and why perhaps she adopted some of the personality characteristics that became entrenched for her later in life. And so that does tend to shift the lens a little bit from seeing Amber Heard as just sort of this raging monster, as somebody who wasn't necessarily born this way, didn't necessarily choose to be this way, but was shaped by potentially pretty bad circumstances, had to learn how to cope with those. And part of that, frankly, was learning how to find a weak target that she could capitalize on their loyalty, their gratitude, whatever type of bond they had with her, and then use that as an outlet for her own rage and her own anger. Perhaps that's maybe not helpful to the extent that it suggests possibly a similar pattern that she engaged in with Johnny, which would corroborate, again, his version of what this relationship between them was like. So then some facts that we got from these new documents that were not so helpful to Amber and were a little bit more favorable to Johnny. We've already talked about the new transcript of the argument between them in September of 2015, where we see some new admissions, not just of the Boston Plain incident, but some additional violence as well, and a little bit more context for how these conversations about the violence would tend to go that do not cast a favorable light on Amber at all. So this conversation was talking about the bathroom incident. You'll remember this from trial as the one where the door went over her toes and she slammed the door into his head. And then when he opened the door, she punched him in the face. And so in this transcript, we see first off, there was violence that preceded this bathroom incident in the first place. What had happened was Johnny had been over at Isaac Baruch's house. He was there, I guess, a little bit longer than Amber would have liked. So she was stewing and raging while he was gone. And when he came back, she flew into a rage, kicked him out of the bed, kicked him out of the bedroom, and slammed the bedroom door into his head as he was leaving. So it was after this point then that those incidents related to the bathroom then took place. So new evidence about that particular incident, the scope of the violence that Johnny endured, and Amber Heard's knowledge of it as well. We already heard her in the original video talking about how she just reacted to the thing with her toes, and she meant to hit him. She didn't mean to kick the door into the head, but she did mean to hit him. And we see that fleshed out a little bit more in these transcripts as well, that in fact she had punched him. According to her, she didn't intend to. But what we do see is as well her minimization and blame shifting that she engages in the course of these discussions. So we see her blaming Ambien for all of this. She had taken an Ambien, and, knowing herself and her character as she does, she certainly wouldn't have done any of these things. It must be the Ambien's fault. This is pretty classic non-accountability for something as serious as engaging in physical violence with somebody. We also see this pattern where Amber will constantly revisit these old fights, bring up these old fights, specifically Toronto, which we learned a lot more about from the evidence at trial. While at the same time, saying she doesn't want to fight about old fights. You can just only imagine how frustrating this process of argument is for Johnny, and we see some of his comments to that effect in this transcript as well. But particularly what we see is her eagerness to disparage Johnny for having his own feelings of being wronged. We see Amber clearly maintaining that she is the only one who can be a victim in these arguments, and that if Johnny said mean things to her in Toronto, then therefore the fact that she also said terrible things to him in Toronto is somehow negated, that doesn't count, it doesn't matter. Johnny isn't allowed to have hurt feelings, anger, resentment about those things. To the contrary, Amber will tell him that it's annoying that he has those feelings and he should simply stop bringing them up. So if that doesn't look to you like the behavior of an abuser who doesn't want to take responsibility for the harm that they've inflicted, then I just think you're probably looking for what you want to see. Another new piece of information that we saw from Amber came from a deposition excerpt where she claims to have reported the Australia bottle rape incident to every gynecologist she's ever had, as well as her fertility doctor. And yet, when called upon to provide a single name, she's unable to do so. So this, again, is classic Amber from all the way back in 2016, where we first saw her trying to hide behind claims that she has all of this medical evidence that somehow has never materialized. We have seen a pattern of Amber Heard asserting that stuff exists, that witnesses exist, that documents exist that support her version of events, but we never actually get to see. So this is just another example of this same pattern that when it's put up or shut up time, Amber Heard is not going to be willing to name those doctors because she knows perfectly well Johnny's team will simply go and subpoena them and ask them for that corroboration. And we have to perhaps assume that she knows that wouldn't be favorable, and that's why she won't give those names. Similarly, we see Amber Heard basically call out the individuals that she claims would have supported her having the injuries that she has alleged to have suffered at the hands of Johnny Depp. And so she identifies Dr. Kipper, Monroe Tinker, Aaron Borum, Debbie Lloyd. And yet what we saw at trial is that with one single exception, Aaron Burham, who testified, saw the bloody lip on December the 17th, none of these individuals substantiated her claim that they would support her account of these injuries. And in fact, to the complete opposite, we saw that record from Monroe Tinker at trial where he did the physical examination and found everything is normal. She has no injuries. She's there reporting a headache, but nothing that would substantiate the black eyes, broken nose, ribs, etc., hair pulled out that she claimed to have suffered in that December 15th incident. Along those same lines, another piece of new evidence that we got was, from my standpoint, very interesting. We got to see what Dr. Collins, Johnny's pathologist, would have testified to. We didn't get to see Dr. Collins testify at trial. It's not entirely clear why that is. There were some reports or conversation at the time that it was because she had been disclosed only as a rebuttal witness to one of Amber Heard's witnesses. So then when Amber Heard didn't call that witness, there was no basis to independently call Dr. Collins. But we now have the expert disclosures for all of the experts, including Dr. Collins, and that does not appear to be the case. She was disclosed as both a case-in-chief witness and a rebuttal witness. So I don't have an answer for why she didn't testify. It may have simply been that Johnny's team decided not to call her, that it wasn't necessary. But nevertheless, we got a little insight into what information she would have brought. And so we see from that her opinion was, number one, she's able to describe the types of injuries that you would expect to see based on the incidents of violence that Amber Heard reported. And so that shows the disconnect between for example, the massive injury that you would expect from the account that she reported about the December 15th incident, and then what you actually see on, for example, the late night show, her actual physical condition as it was observed by other people. She also testified to the difference between the types of injuries that were claimed and expected from these accounts and what was actually visible, if at all, on Amber Heard's evidence. And so here we got the corroboration that, frankly, anybody with eyes has known for the last 6 years, which is that Amber Heard's bruise picture from the May 27th courthouse run, yeah, that was a zit. She took photographs of her acne. They do not depict actual injuries. So this is a new bit of evidence, perhaps not the most compelling thing in the world because it is to some extent common sense. You don't necessarily need a doctor to tell you that when somebody reports getting hit repeatedly in the face with heavy rings, that there would be serious injuries that would be visible on a person as a result of that. But it is still kind of fun to get that confirmation and to see that nail really could have been driven home with testimony from a medical expert who handles these types of things. So the last piece of new evidence that came out in these files that shed some light on the leaking, the PR maneuvering, the issues that we saw vis-a-vis Amber Heard's use of the press to further her narrative, is that there seems to be some indication that this was happening long before they split up, and in fact, before they were even ever married. We see a email that involves Johnny Depp's publicist, Robin Baum, being asked to comment by the National Enquirer, who received information that purports to relate Amber Heard's feelings and impressions about her relationship with Johnny and her view that, let's just say, things were not so good and she felt a bit put upon by that relationship. Of course, we know from the facts that didn't stop her from going on to marry him a couple of months later. But I did find it interesting to see that it does look like we can see this narrative beginning to be pushed through these selective leaks to sources who aren't necessarily going to be rigid about requiring direct, strict confirmation of what it is that they're reporting. And so the fact that as early as December of 2014, whether directly or through her own mouthpieces who passed on this type of information, it looks like Amber Heard was beginning to plant these seeds in the press of how terrible Johnny Depp is and how victimized she is by that relationship. It really, I think, highlights just the damage that she was willing to inflict on him and that he had to endure throughout an even longer period than maybe we realized. We saw, of course, for a long period of time that she was willing to wield these allegations against him. But this is the first time that we see the public smear beginning to emerge so early. So that, I think, was a telling insight into their relationship and the nature of those dynamics. So as far as facts that bear upon the issues that were actually decided at trial, this is really what we got from the Unsealing. The overwhelming majority of what else has come to light and has been discussed in social media and, frankly, even in mainstream outlets have little to nothing to do with the actual merits of the case and instead reflect more on the gamesmanship and the strategies that the parties employed in the litigation process. So we're going to take a look at the smear merchants and what they have chosen to focus on, what they have chosen to highlight, and the ways that they have either deliberately or just out of ignorance have chosen to distort what the actual record of these documents shows and why it was so important for these documents to be available for everyone to be able to verify for themselves. What do they actually contain? What is actually fact? And what is simply narrative? What is argument that is being presented as fact for the purpose of being able to support the preferred messaging?